One. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Welsh Republic podcast, episode 150 today. And I am here with my guest, Rahul. How are you doing today, Rahul?
I'm great. Thank you for inviting me, Welsh. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in whatever time zone in the world. From a happy and sunny South Africa, I'm very privileged and very honored to be on your show, Welsh. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a very honor to welcome. It's an honor to have you on here, Rahul. Rahul, how's the weather going in South Africa at the moment? Like, is it because you guys are now going into your summer period? Like, how's the weather been there? And what have you been up to today? Anything much?
So it's actually autumn here now, and we will be going into winter in a couple of months' time. But it's a very special day, Welsh, that you have chosen to do this conversation with us. Today happens to be officially the 30th birthday of South Africa. For those of us who have been progressive and involved in the struggle for liberation and democracy in South Africa, we don't regard anything before 1994 as officially South Africa. Yes, of course, it's part of our history and part of the struggle to bring South Africa to where it is today. But today, on the 27th of April, 1994, was the first time that all South Africans of all colors and all genders were able to go and make their mark and participate in a free and democratic election. And that was 30 years ago today. So today is the celebration of Freedom Day. It's an exciting day. There are celebrations taking place all over the country. Obviously, with that, there's a lot of nostalgia, a lot of celebratory mood. But at the same time, there is some despondency, there is some disillusionment, I must confess and acknowledge, because, after 30 years of democracy, perhaps a lot more was expected in terms of addressing apartheid and its vestiges. But again, it doesn't take away from the fact that we are in celebration today in South Africa. It's our Freedom Day. It's our 30th birthday.
That must mean so much. South Africa is really a country that has come forward, because I remember watching the film Invictus, Rahul. That is a great film. And I remember, in a scene in that movie, and that's the one with Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon, where Matt Damon plays Ruan Pienaar, the former South Africa captain, and Morgan Freeman plays Nelson Mandela. Really great film. And I remember watching that film and showing how the impact it had about South Africa, and how there was one scene in it where you had this white guy who was coaching a rugby team, and he was saying, "Oh, this is the day that South Africa goes to the Ducks," and it was ridiculous. And going back to that, Rahul, going back to that. So the apartheid, as we all know, was from 1948 to 1994. Basically, it was a thing that lasted for over 40 years. So tell me about, the apartheid from South Africa. So, as a South African yourself, right? This went on obviously from 1948 to 1994. What was it like for you growing up in that period of South Africa when you were going through apartheid? What was it like growing up through there? What was one of the worst things that you saw that the National Party of South Africa, the what's it called? Sorry, before I ask the question, what's the National Party of South Africa called? Or was that party called?
Yes, National Party. Yes, the National Party. That's
that
quite
National Party.
Sorry,
not finished the question
perhaps
yet. But like I was saying, that the National Party, what they were like. Tell me. So, like I was saying, what was it like? What does this day for you mean as a South African National Freedom Day? What was it like during the apartheid of South Africa? What were the things that, the apartheid government of South Africa did, which was terrible? The acts they did to people, how they did, what type of policy they did, and tell me more. Basically, just enlighten us.
Okay. Thanks for the question, Well. So perhaps we should go back, just as we talk about in Palestine, it didn't start on the 7th of October. So in the same thing in South Africa, it didn't start in 1948. It goes back much earlier than that. So without being too laborious and protracted in my response, it is though extremely important to understand the course of history of South Africa. So in just a couple of minutes, if you and your listeners will bear with me, I'll take you through that. So the marker that we normally use is 1652, when a Dutch settlers, a few of them, not many of them, under Jan van Riebeeck, arrived at the Cape. But prior to that, there were excursions in an attempt to find a trade sea route around the coast of Africa to the east from Europe. And of course, important explorers and mariners like Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Dias, they did round the Cape of Good Hope. And during the course of the 1500s and early 1600s, when ships were passing by, the local people, particularly in what is today known as Cape Town and what is today known as Durban on the eastern coast, were trading with ships that were passing by. And then the Dutch, under the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, decided to send a group of settlers here under Jan van Riebeeck, and that happened in 1652. So when they came and they settled there, of course, that was the beginning of colonialism. That was the beginning of apartheid, in a sense that it became the starting point where people of a fairer complexion who had come to settle here began systematically dominating and overpowering and discriminating against those of a darker complexion. So 1652. Since then, when the Dutch settled here, and after that others came, French Huguenots came here, British came, Germans came, there were many what we would like to call liberation wars or battles by the Khoi, by the San, by the Zulus, by the Xhosas against the settlers. And over a period of 300 years, so from 1652 right through until the late 1800s, there were these wars. And eventually, in 1899 to 1902, then the white people, the British settlers, fought against the Dutch settlers for South Africa. And as we both know, the British won that, what is called the Anglo-Boer War, or the South African War. And in 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed. And the reason it was called the Union of South Africa is that prior to that, there were four South African republics, so-called South African republics. There was the Cape Republic, there was the Transvaal Republic, the Free State Republic, and the Natal Republic. And the four of them came together to form a union. And in that unionization of South Africa, they excluded all black people. Now, when I say all black people, this is especially important because there were the indigenous people, that's the Khoi, the San, the Zulus, the Pedis, the Xhosas, the Tswanas, the Shonas, all of them were still here. Then there were, in the late 1800s through to the early 1900s, laborers, indentured laborers, slaves were brought through from India, which is where my ancestors come from. So they were brought here because South Africa was part of the British Empire, and they came through to South Africa. So there were Indians, well, also black people. We are black people, just like our indigenous brothers and sisters. And then, of course, there are what we call colored people who, through the interrace affairs between the white settlers and the indigenous population is where most colored people, they can trace their ancestry to. And so all black people, so Indians, coloreds, and Africans, were excluded from the Constitution of South Africa in 1910. And eventually, so within that Union of South Africa, where the government comprised of the Afrikaners, as we would call them today, or the Dutch descendants, and the British English, eventually what you then mentioned in 1948, the National Party, which was, the descendants of the Dutch and the Afrikaners, they came into power. Now, Welsh, prior, okay, so I'm going to stop there for now. Are there any questions about that so far? Or can I go
on? What I was just wondering was, so the Nationalist Party came into power from, was it 1936? It was 1936, right? Correct.
No.
They came into power.
No.
Oh, no. 1948.
No, 1948.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was the National Party, which was introduced by F.D.W. de Klerk. When you were living in that time of South Africa, during that National Party that was controlling South Africa and putting so much division and putting so much harsh laws onto the black population, what was it like during that time, as a South African for yourself, living under the National Party's rule? And what would you say was as a South African, what would you say was the most horrific story of a black person you saw being segregated or treated like crap? And what would you say was the most disgusting bill that government ever introduced? Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. Okay, I don't go back that far to 1948. I'm not that old, but yes, certainly I did live during the latter part of the apartheid years. But your question is very important about the legislation, the acts that were to regulate apartheid. So I think the first most draconian piece of legislation was the Land Act of 1913, where they literally stole 90% of the land of South Africa and put it into white hands. So 10% of the population were just at the stroke of a pen through the 1913 Land Act were given 90% of the land in South Africa. Then the other acts that came into being was the Population Registration Act, which, among other things, categorized us as white, black, Indian, and colored. So the black people, which is African, Indian, and colored, they divided us further as African, Indian, and colored. And then the other acts, of course, were the Group Areas Act. The Group Areas Act was also an important piece of legislation that came in after 1948, where they so if you look at town planning, and town planning is an important part in the social development of any community, any city throughout the world. The way the city is planned and the way it occurs and evolves over time is important. So you have the CBD, and then just around the CBD were reserved for white areas. And then further than that, around that, you'd have Indian and colored areas, and then even further away, all the African areas. And in the provision of services, that's how it was meted out, in terms of those categories. So typically, if you were able to get a job in the CBD, that's where work was. If you were an African person, you'd have to wake up maybe 3 or 4 hours earlier than a white person in order to get to work. And then you'd have to take maybe 3 or 4 buses or taxis more than the others. So it's about your time and your money that you would have to spend to going there. But over and above that, there was job reservation. So uh, only white people were allowed to be managers and professionals. Then Indians and Khaleds were allowed to be up to a certain level of artisans. So my dad and his brothers and sisters could have skilled work, but they weren't allowed to be managers. And then African people were only allowed to be laborers and servants. So typically in an African school, the girls would learn how to, literally, I'm telling you this, would learn how to wash clothes and iron clothes, because according to Verwoerd, who was the leader of the National Party in the 1940s and 1950s, that was the only type of work that he believed and the National Party believed that they were capable of. And the boys, African boys in school, would learn how to do gardening, because according to the apartheid policy and mindset, is that that was all that they were capable of. And that went on for quite a while. In 1912, the African National Congress was established. And in the beginning, for the first 20 or so years of its existence, the ANC leadership would write letters to the British throne and to the government to ask for more freedoms than that. Of course, there was Mahatma Gandhi, who came here, who started the Indian Congress, and then there was a Cape Coloured Congress and a Congress of Democrats, and that's what we call the Congress movement, which fought against apartheid. And in 1948 and 1952, under the Youth League leadership of Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu, Raymond Mhlaba, Ahmed Kathrada, Govan Mbeki, and others, they then had major defiance campaigns. And another marker in our history is 1955, where we had the Congress of the People, where everyone from throughout South Africa got together or was represented at the Congress of the People and drew up perhaps the most democratic document ever written. It's called the Freedom Charter in Kliptown in 1955. That was drawn up. And as you would know, in 1960, on the 21st of March, at a peaceful gathering to protest against the pass laws. So one of the laws that was also passed by South Africa, by the South African apartheid regime, was the pass laws. So any African person was not allowed to walk around anywhere, or if he or she did, a police officer could come to you and demand to see your passbook, and would beat you up if you didn't have one, or if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was really, it was draconian. We were not allowed, like my parents and uncles and aunts, we were not allowed to own a business in an area other than a designated Indian area, for example. But a white person like yourself could come here from England or wherever it is and open up a business in our area. So whether you talk of education or health, both the infrastructure thereof and also the services that you were allowed to get or not get was all dependent on what race you were categorized as. So if you were categorized as white, you would have the best education, the best healthcare, the best infrastructure, parks would be beautiful, streets would be okay, the beaches, you were allowed to go to any beach that you wanted to, and so on and so forth. Then secondly were Indians. So me and my ancestors, we could go to certain beaches, but not all of the beaches. We had a certain level of education that was afforded to us, much worse than white people, but better than someone who was categorized as colored or African. And the same, like I said, with parks and recreation, the same with any and every facet of life, and then worse still for coloreds, and even worse for Africans. So that was the structure of apartheid. And then economically, like I said, job reservation, that was how it was structured. So in every single aspect of life, apartheid left no stone unturned. It deliberately sought to create economic classes, social and economic classes along racial lines. And fortunately, we were able to, as activists within the movement for non-racism and non-sexism, we were able to analyze and understand the apartheid mission, and thus able to fight against it properly. Unfortunately, though, and as we celebrate Freedom Day today, 30 years into democracy, the legacy of apartheid, the vestiges of apartheid, the structure of apartheid, the economy of apartheid, the socio-economic fabric and infrastructure of apartheid is still very much in place today as it was 30 years ago. Because it's going to take a lot. We've had 350 years of apartheid. So it cannot take a mere 30 years to overturn that. However, the people of South Africa, Black people in South Africa, including myself and most others, have grown impatient with our current government. It has been an ANC government since the start. So initially we were patient, but now people have become extremely impatient because the redressing of the apartheid structure, the socio-economic structure of apartheid, is taking far too long. It needs to be accelerated. And unfortunately, as we reflect on our 30 years of democracy, we've got to admit and acknowledge that our ANC government has made many mistakes in two respects. The one respect is the same song that people sing all of the time about corruption and inefficiency and ineffectiveness and all of that, and we can have a chat about that. But the other thing is that we have unfortunately succumbed to the world order, instead of in a very decisive and deliberate way, instead of addressing, for example, the economy, we have merely perpetuated the apartheid economy. So it's not coincidental that even 30 years later, the only billionaires that we have, barring one, are all white. It's not coincidental that among the top jobs in South Africa, at senior executive level, most of them are white and male, you see. And among all of the bottom jobs, most are Black. It's not coincidental. It's by apartheid design and architecture. And even if you look at things like mortality rates, if you look at unemployment, youth unemployment, household income, the apartheid structure is still very much there. So you still have whites right on top, followed by Indians, then coloreds, then Africans. And we need to, again, as we very harshly and necessarily and sincerely reflect on our 30 years of democracy, we need to say that, Welsh, we need to say to ourselves that, look, we need to accelerate the redressing of the apartheid structure. We must take the structure of apartheid and turn it on its head. And unfortunately, we pine too much to the right-wing chorus that says things like, well, if we do that, if we insist on affirmative action and Black economic empowerment, then there's going to be a drop in standards, a drop in quality. And that's a lot of racist nonsense. So sorry to be a bit long-winded about it, but just in a nutshell, to answer your question, is that Under apartheid, every single facet of life, you can name whatever it is, whether it was your access to finance, where you swam in the ocean, the house that you were able to live in, the area that you lived in, the park that you had access to or not access to, the water that you either had or didn't have, electricity, many people didn't have. So every single aspect of life was within the apartheid structure. It restricted movement. It restricted the ability to do anything. It restricted thinking, or so they thought. And that legacy of apartheid, in a large way, is still with us, and that needs to be addressed quite decisively going forward.
So during the period of the late 1980s, where the whole world was being aware of the apartheid in South Africa, a lot of the laws, were ending. A lot of, the pressure from governments around the world, they were pressuring the government of South Africa at that time to end its apartheid system and all that, especially like when you look in 1993 and 1991, when the South African president repeals the rest of the apartheid laws and calls for drafting of a new constitution, which is a very important day in South Africa. At that time, when you were a youngster yourself, how did it feel in 1994 when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa, which is like such just an amazing moment in South Africa, like for any event in history, a guy that was prisoned for 30 years, and especially when he was just protesting, for freedom back in which he was arrested in 1963 and put in jail in 1963, and going back to that, Rahul, how did it feel for you as a South African in 1994 when Nelson Mandela became president? What was it like at the time? What was the feelings in the country, and how was the nation feeling together when Nelson Mandela was released?
It's still it still brings goosebumps. There's a lot of nostalgia, especially for those of us who were involved in the struggle to bring democracy, non-racism, non-sexism to South Africa. The first time ever as a very young person, when I went to vote, and even now up until today, every time that I am able to go and vote, every time we have an election, it's a euphoric moment. It is a moment that I personally savor. When I go into that voting booth, I pick up the ballot paper, I read every single word on the ballot paper, I look at it, I hold it. I savor that moment because it is a culmination of struggle. And when we say struggle, sometimes perhaps we use the word in normal discourse that perhaps it loses its significance. South African people struggled to bring us this democracy. You mentioned Nelson Mandela, but there were many, many others. Walter Sisulu, O.R. Tambo, Mama Winnie Mandela, who suffered the most under apartheid, Albertina Sisulu, Helen Joseph, so many of them went to prison, went into exile. And when we say that they went into exile, in the beginning, when O.R. Tambo and others went into exile, that was during the 1960s. So they weren't just openly accepted with open arms in other countries. They really, really struggled to get the world to become, aware of what was happening in South Africa. There was no internet at that time. There were no, it wasn't a Pony Express, but it wasn't that easy to get information around. So people struggled. Many, many, many people died, were executed. Still up until today, a lot of the heinous, callous things, brutal atrocities that the apartheid authorities meted out on the people of South Africa are still being uncovered. And many of those atrocities have been buried in the graves of those South African apartheid protagonists who refused to come forth with the truth. So there are still people today who wonder about what happened to my father, what happened to my mother, what happened to my brother, what happened to my sister, what happened to my son, what happened to my daughter, because they went to a meeting, a political meeting, and just never came back. So it was a long, hard, deep struggle that took a lot of courage, bravery, conviction, principle to stand up for what was right. So for me, as I'm sure it is for most South Africans, it was when we went to vote for the first time on the 27th of April, 1994, when Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first president of a democratic South Africa. It was just, heart, I don't know the words to describe it, but euphoric, something that we can never, ever forget, because again, as I say, it symbolized in a very deep and profound way a culmination of centuries of struggle, a struggle that was long and hard, that took many people's lives. Many people were executed, were tortured. You think of Steve Biko, who was tortured in a way in which it's still you cannot understand how human beings can be so brutal to other human beings simply because of the color of their skin. You think of Solomon Mahlangu, who was the first person who was martyred. He was hanged, and so many others. You think of Winnie Mandela. Winnie Mandela, her husband was taken away from her, put into jail. She was banished to an area. Her movement was restricted. She had young children with her, babies, and at 2:00 in the morning, the apartheid police would just come into her house and arrest her and take her away. And the children didn't know where their mother was going to. And she would just be tortured and kept in prison in solitary confinement for like 90 days, and then released and then rearrested. So yeah, it does makes one very emotional, unfortunately, but at the same time, it allows us to appreciate the fact that this democracy that we have today did not come easily, and therefore we must cherish it and we must continue to work at it so that we truly build a South Africa that is non-racist, non-sexist, and equal for all.
That is very true. Raul, a lot of right-wingers do this stupid thing where they say, what is your feeling towards all these right-wingers and conservatives, like from Fox News or Rebel News and all that stuff, who come out, or Tommy Robertson or something, or Paul Joseph Watson, who come out and Laura Southern, and come out and say like, oh, South Africa was better back then. It was better, when the British controlled it. Oh, Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. He was this, he was that. What is your feelings towards it? And what is your feeling also towards, all of the right-wingers about the whole, white farmers being killed, about the whole, how the, white farmers that are being killed? What is your feelings towards that? Like, what are the true facts about that? And what are the facts that are not true about that?
Yeah, so it's so insulting and offensive and insincere on the part of many of the. Look, obviously, if there is a God, he or she knows why they've made us different. I don't know and I don't understand. So firstly, let's just address the facts. Okay. It can never, ever be said. I, myself, am not happy with our current government, that they haven't done everything that they should have done in the way that it should have been done. Yes, there is corruption. Yes, there is inefficiency, ineffectiveness. There are, many more houses that should be built. There are many more roads that should be tarred. Healthcare, public healthcare needs to be improved dramatically. So too with public education and so on and so forth. But no one, absolutely no one who is being honest can ever compare the democracy that we have to the apartheid years. I was a little boy. I was, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. And my mom worked at a company, and her boss was a white man, and his son was about the same age as I was. And we became friends. And one day we decided to go to a movie. And so, we got dropped off there, and we went into the movie house, and I was stopped. My brother and we were stopped from going into the movie. But this boy, his name was Richard, and his sister were allowed to go in. And I mean, now here I'm 6, 7 years old. We're not allowed to go into a movie. I think it was a Jackie Chan movie or something like that, we weren't allowed to go in simply because the color of my friend was paler than my complexion. No other reason. I mean, I wasn't a misbehaved child or anything like that. Those kinds of things. You go to the beach and you're not allowed to, you can walk on the sidewalk, but you're not allowed to put your foot onto the sand. I mean, it's God's earth, those things, you see. My father was an engineer. He was not allowed to be a manager where he worked, even though he may have known more than those who he reported to. You see, and so on and so forth. I mean, education, healthcare, all of that. So yes, a lot more has to be done, but you can never, ever compare. You cannot compare. Never mind the right to vote, which is sacrosanct and important. But since democracy, so I'll give you a couple of examples. Okay, so on the 27th of April, 1994, 80% of the South African population did not have electricity. 80%, 80. Today, 5% of South Africans don't have electricity directly, and they are because they are in informal settlements. Running water. So in the township, for example, there were hardly any tarred roads. And in one little street of a dirt road, you'd have one tap for all of the shacks in that street. And that one tap would have to serve an entire community of 200 or 300 people for everything from bathing to washing their clothes to cooking to anything else that you would need to use the water for. So anyone who says that you can even begin to even contemplate a comparison between apartheid and democracy is lying, is being extremely dishonest, racist ends. There's no way that it can be compared. Having said that, Welsh, the criticism against government for not having accelerated service delivery to the levels that it should be, those criticisms are good. They are constructive. They are welcome. And we should continue to criticize our own government. That's the basis of democracy, So yes, for example, we've produced now many more professionals out of our education system who are Black. So whether they are doctors or lawyers or engineers or microbiologists or marine biologists or rocket scientists or human resource development professionals or international relations professionals or historians or sociologists or whatever. Yes, we produced a hell of a lot more, but still we haven't changed when you talk about education, for example, we haven't significantly changed the apartheid structure about education. The same thing with healthcare, for example, and so on and so forth. So those vestiges of apartheid still need to be broken decisively. And because our government, I believe, in my opinion, are still caught up in the existing world order of pandering to the neoliberal sentiment of contextualizing our development within a capitalist system. That's where the problem lies, along with the fact that, yes, there is corruption, yes, there is inefficiency.
That is very, very true. You know, Raul, so you said the South African elections are coming up right now, right? So tell me about South Africa. So tell me about South Africa's election system right now. Like, how does the political system work there right now? How does the voting work? How does the process of like the parliament system work? How much do like the globalist elite, how much control do they have over South Africa's government? And what is your opinion on the people who say, you know, to that guy who the right wingers were saying that he's a guy who basically says that all white people should be killed? And the facts around that, did he actually say that, or was that taken out of context? I can't remember the name of the person, but yeah, you probably know what I mean. So go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I do. Yeah. So let me just give you a rundown of the South African governance structure. So we have, for all intents and purposes, we have a unitary state, which means we have strong central or national government, and within the national government, there's an executive, which is the president and the ministers who he or she appoints, and a parliament of 400 people. Now, we don't elect a president directly. For the parliament of 400 people, we vote for a political party. So when you get your ballot, for the national parliament, you get a ballot with all the political parties listed there, those who have registered to contest the national election. So African National Congress, Democratic Alliance, Economic Freedom Fighters, the MK Party, Mkhonto we Sizwe, the UDM, United Democratic Movement, and a number of other parties. So all of them are on the national ballot. Then in addition to that, we have 9 provinces. Now, these are not states. We don't have a federal system. These are provinces. They are regions, if you will, but they have, according to our constitution, they do have certain powers. I wouldn't want to say autonomous powers, but they have certain powers and authority that is afforded to them, but none of that can ever supersede the national powers. So those 9 provinces, we also elect according to the size of their respective populations. We elect a legislature. And again, according to party, so proportional representation. So again, you know, ANC, EFF, MK, UDM, ATM, all of these parties would be registered there, and then we elect for each province. Now, each province then in turn, so let's just say in the Eastern Cape, let's say 70% of the vote goes to the ANC. Then 70% of the provincial members of the provincial legislature would be made up of the ANC. And in addition to that, from each of the provinces, 10 people go to the National Council of Provinces, like a Senate. So the 400 members of the National Assembly, who are voted in accordance with proportional representation per political party, plus the 90 members from the Council of Provinces, which makes up 490. So that's the National Assembly. And then that National Assembly, at its first sitting of the National Assembly, they elect a president, an executive president. So if any political party gets more than 50% in the national elections, and the ANC has done that consistently through all the elections, then of course it stands to reason that the leader of that political party, in this case the ANC, becomes the president. Currently, though, the recent polls and surveys indicate that the ANC may not get more than 50%. They may fall below the 50%, which means that the ANC will be forced into a coalition. Now, here's where the political science comes in. So you have, if you say the ANC is, say, middle of the political spectrum, then to the right of that political spectrum would be the DA, which at the moment is the official opposition. The DA's roots and foundations come from the National Party, the Apartheid party, coupled with what was like a liberal party called the Democratic Party. So it's an amalgamation of those two. You'd also have the Freedom Front Plus, the ACDP, and a couple of other smaller parties who would be on the right of the political spectrum. Then on the left of that political spectrum, you would have the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, and I'm going to come back to the EFF because that's the one you specifically asked me about. And then you'd have the MK. Now, MK is Mkhonto weSizwe. So our former president, the Jacob Zuma, who was the president of the ANC previously, he is now the leader of the MK party, and they have been making significant inroads into the constituency base of both the ANC as well as the EFF. Then you'd also have the UDM, the United Democratic Movement, led by General Bantu Holomisa. Good guy, he's been in politics for quite a while. And you'd have a couple of other parties like the ATM and perhaps one or two others like a Workers' Party, which perhaps is only contesting in some provinces and maybe nationally, but not all. So that's the political environment at the moment. Now, let's say the ANC does not get the 50%, which many of the polls is indicating. Then the ANC will have a choice to go into a coalition with either the DA on the right side or the EFF and MK and whoever else on the left side. Now, you asked me about, the world order and that. So obviously, the billionaire class, the Western politicians, the media, which is very much controlled by, the Western neoliberal perspective, including the South African media to a large extent. So they are pushing for the ANC to go into a coalition with the DA so that the neoliberal hegemony is maintained. There are others, like myself, who believe that the ANC should go into a coalition with the leftist side, with the EFF or MK or whoever. But that remains to be seen. At the moment, the coalition talk is largely speculative because we don't know what the outcomes on the 29th of May are going to be. Now, let's talk about the EFF that you specifically asked for, the Economic Freedom Fighters. So, the EFF is headed by Julius Malema. Julius Malema is a former leader of the ANC Youth League. So traditionally and historically, the Youth League was always a radical a movement within the movement of the ANC, and justifiably and rightfully so. So whereas you would have the elders of the ANC speaking in pragmatic tones, you'd have the youth speaking in very radical tones to make sure there's an acceleration of redressing the vestiges of apartheid, and so on and so forth. Julius Malema, for whatever reason, because of a number of things, he was expelled from the ANC, and he then went on to form the Economic Freedom Fighters. So many of the members of the ANC Youth League at that time went with him and joined the EFF. And the EFF is only 10 years old. Last year, I think they reached 10 years. And in that time, they have grown significantly. Now, the South African struggle was fought on a number of fronts. So the South African struggle was fought politically. It was fought in terms of the cultural boycott, with sports, with drama. And among the measures that inspired the struggle for democracy and non-racism and non-sexism in South Africa was song. Our people love to sing. It's an act of unity. It's an act of harmony. If you get 100 people, 1,000 people singing together, it builds you, it inspires you, it lifts you, and it harmonizes you. So among the struggle songs that we have is a song called Dubulu. I'll get the name. Okay. So a literal translation of a line of that song, a literal translation into English says, kill the boer, kill the farmer. Okay? That's a literal translation. Now, if you read Shakespeare, or if you listen to any song, Billy Joel, Elton John, Ed Sheeran, whoever it is, no music is written in a literal sense. So if Ed Sheeran sings, I will climb up Mount Everest to prove my love to you, does it mean that tomorrow Ed Sheeran is going to take a hike up Mount Everest? I mean, it doesn't work that way. It's art, it's music, So when we sing, when Julius Malema, for example, as the leader of the EFF, when he sings that song in Xhosa or Zulu or Sotho, and the literal translation is kill the boer, kill the farmer, the term boer or farmer is symbolic of apartheid. So we were talking about sports earlier that was not on air. Off air, we were talking about Rugby World Cup and all of that. So in South Africa, for example, the springbok is the national symbol for the SA rugby team. And for a long time, many of us could not support the springbok as a symbol because the springbok under apartheid came to denote apartheid. It became a symbol of apartheid, a symbol of racism, of sexism, of discrimination, of prejudice, of brutality, of atrocity, you see, of imprisonment without trial, of separation. So in the same way, the term in that song, the term boer means apartheid. So when Julius Malema sings kill the boer, he's saying kill apartheid, kill all the vestiges of apartheid, kill non-racism, kill racism, kill sexism, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing like that. Now, there's a group in South Africa called AfriForum, and it's headed by a gentleman by the name of Ernst Roots. And Ernst Roots and others have somehow conjured up a narrative, an extremely false but dangerous narrative, which they are propagating, this false lie that says that farmers, white Afrikaner farmers are being genocided by black people in South Africa. And the chief reason that they do this is to get money. Because if you look at AfriForum's accounts, they get money from right-wing support groups, particularly in America and the UK and certain parts of Eastern Europe. So right now, Roots is on a trip in Europe. As we speak right now, he's there. And he is attending many of these right-wing conferences together with some very, very shady, far right-wing people, where he is given a platform to go and speak about this. But the numbers just don't make any sense. So a farm murder, and murder is a crime, is a problem in South Africa, a big problem in South Africa. Most of the crime is in urban areas. Most of the murders are in urban areas. Most of the crime is in urban areas as well. And most of murders happen among people who are known to each other. But Ernst and them are saying that every time a farmer is killed, which is very few and far between, that this is an act of genocide. Now, for it to be an act of genocide, you need to say that there's a deliberate, systematic plan to wipe out a certain community. None of that takes place. What happens is, because of the gross differences that we have in income levels in South Africa, so typically you would have someone in a city, and it happens all over the world, unfortunately, who will go and break into a house and rob the house and possibly murder the occupants of that house. And that is a problem in South Africa. But it's when you take all of those murders, for example, and you have a percentage of that for those that would happen on a farm, it's tiny, it's minuscule. Now, that is not to say that one should dilute the importance of addressing crime, and particularly murder in South Africa. That must be addressed, because we cannot live in fear from criminals. But at the same time, there is absolutely nothing that is even close to the truth when these guys say that there's a farm killing pandemic in South Africa. Nothing can be further from the truth, and people are more than welcome to check the official statistics for South Africa, check the statistics at every police station, check the statistics this year, over the past 2 years, over the past 10 years, over the past 30 years, and nothing comes even close to supporting that narrative. But because of the fact that these guys have a considerable amount of resources, they are able to garner some kind of traction, and it's self-perpetuating, because they are then able to acquire funds to support that narrative. So that's where it is. So there's absolutely nothing like that, Welsh.
So, Raul, how do you see the future of South Africa going, knowing that there's BRICS now, knowing that the United States, as people are saying, the United States empire is collapsing, it's losing its dominance? How do you see what do you think South Africa's role is going to be in this new multipolar world, with China and Russia being the dominant superpowers? What do you think that, the multipolar world will help South Africa bring its potential out, knowing how South Africa has a lot of, national resources and a lot of gas and a lot of this? How do you see it going forward? Do you think the future of South Africa is bright, or do you think it still has a bit of a way to go? And do you think it will thrive under the new multipolar world? And how do you see the future, like, for Africa as a continent, for countries like Nigeria, Ghana, like Rwanda, all of those countries that have potential? How do you see the future of South Africa and the future of Africa going forward under the new multipolar world and BRICS?
Yeah, these are Welsh. These are interesting times, beautiful times, historical time. You and I, and the rest of us who are alive today, we have the opportunity to change the world, to make it a better place, in terms of it being more equal, more equitable, where there's less, and eventually eradicate starvation and hunger and unemployment and inequality, and so on and so forth. So look, there's a rise and fall over a history of time of empires. I mean, today we read about in history textbooks, we read about the Roman Empire, which ruled much of Western Europe and North Africa for 700, 800 years, a hell of a long time. But we read about it in history today. You see, it's not the same anymore. For a very long time, there was a British Empire, and they used to have a famous saying, the sun rises in the British Empire and sets in the British Empire. So across the globe, they colonized almost everything. They were certainly on every continent except for Antarctica. So, but we read about it in the history books today. So there's no longer a British Empire, well, not at the same extent that it was perhaps 100 years or so ago. Now, in the same way, you have an American empire. It's a matter of fact. It's also a matter of fact that American empire was built in the same way that any other empire was built, through um, through means that no one as a human being can be proud of. It's built through connivance. It's built through military bullying. It's done through lying, I must say, dishonesty, unscrupulous means. But there is this American empire that is there. And one of the ways in which the American empire maintains itself, it's through alliances. And that alliance is what we call today the G7, the group of 7 countries, excuse me, which is America, Canada, Britain and France, Germany, Italy, and of course, Japan. So those 7 countries control everything, particularly from post-World War II, with the establishment of the Bretton Woods organizations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and what was then called the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. Today it's called the WTO. So through that and other organizations like the ICJ and the ICC and a number of other parts of society, like the media in particular, it's not coincidental that media in the Western world in particular is owned by the billionaire class, because the current world order helps them, sustains them, increases their profits. So it's in their interests to own and control the media, because they push a narrative which helps to perpetuate and sustain that inequality of which they are the beneficiaries of. So that's the G7. Then about, 50, 40 years ago, China made the decision to come out of its self-sustainability model and to open itself up as a market and as a trade point with the rest of the world. So, I mean, it's a matter of fact that the highest population in the world is China. So that is a huge market. But in addition to that, whereas Russia's Gorbachev wasn't long enough around to have managed the process of juxtaposing communist ideals with the necessity of trading in terms of capitalism, China was able to manage that process. And because China was able to manage that process, in everything now today, we see China has overtaken the United States of America. So in terms of the economy itself, so the GDP output of China is bigger than that of America. And then China's perspective, world perspective, as opposed to the American perspective, China's perspective is seemingly selfless. So China is investing in the rest of the world, well, whoever it is that would like to partner with China. So China has this Belt and Road Initiative, as you know, which is the goes across Asia right through to Europe. In Africa, China has helped to build I can't remember the name now, but the Great Dam in Ethiopia. I mean, it's a fantastical monument to human development in Africa, the dam there. And there are many other projects that China is undertaking at their own cost within Africa and other parts of the world. Now, if you were an honest economic forecaster and analyst, you would be able, one of the things that analysts do in an objective way is look at the trajectory of growth. So obviously, China now, if you looked at it 10 years ago, you could easily have predicted that China was going to overtake America. And it has, and it's doing so in leaps and bounds. And China, so just below the G7, you would have now China and its economic bloc. I don't want to call them allies because it's not a military alliance, but its economic partners, which fortunately for us as South Africa included us. So when BRICS was formed, it was first BRIC without the S. Then we were invited to join that economic bloc. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, another 5 countries have joined that economic bloc. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Ethiopia, Egypt. Why do I not remember the other one? Iran. Is it Iran? Yes.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a military alliance, not by any means of the imagination, not at all. It's an economic bloc. And that economic bloc obviously represents either, and this depends on your mindset and perspective as to whether you are a selfish or a selfless or developmental person and mindset. So BRICS plus with the 10 countries represents either a threat to the G7 or an opportunity to the G7. Unfortunately, because of, and I must say this, because of the arrogance of America and to an extent UK and the rest of the G7 and Western Europe, who are basically concubines of America. They don't have a voice of their own. They are unthinking and simply follow whatever America says. So instead of seeing BRICS as an opportunity, they regard BRICS, in particular China, as a threat. So proof of that was that when Russia had begun their SMO, their special military operation in Ukraine about a year and a half ago. So when that was initiated, you will notice the words, the sound bites of the Western politicians. Instead of only condemning Russia, they started to say things like, the greatest threat to world peace is China. Now, where did that come from? China was nowhere near the Russian-Ukraine conflict, but they started saying things like that. From Bojo's time, Boris Johnson's time, Biden was saying those things. China is the biggest threat to the world. Blinken was saying that. Hillary Clinton was saying that. Scholz, von der Leyen, who is, oh gosh, I can't even begin to explain her. So they regard China as that threat. And China is saying, guys, we're not threatening anyone. All that we're doing is we're developing our economy in the first instance. And because we understand that our economy cannot cannot develop by itself, out of necessity, we need to see how we can contribute to the development of other economies. And they are doing that by infrastructure, access to finance and so on and so forth. So eventually what is going to happen, Welsh, and again, it doesn't take a professorship in economics to be able to predict this. BRICS Plus will overtake the G7. But if the G7 continues to see it as a competition, which unfortunately the capitalist neoliberal mindset always only looks at it in that way, then they are going to lose out. Instead, and no one's going to listen to little old me, but instead, if they saw this as an opportunity for them to say, hey guys, you know what? You as BRICS Plus and us as the G7, we make up 95% of all world trade. Let's see how we can work together to lift planet Earth out of hunger, starvation, inequality, unemployment. The richest country in the world, potentially, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Potentially. It has almost everything you can think of that is essential in terms of mineral wealth, that is essential to the latest technology throughout the world. Yet, it is mired in conflict and everything else that you can think of. People go to bed starving, children are dying, and the reason for the conflict is simply because there are international players who are involved in the Congo to extract the mineral wealth, and they don't care whether they are funding and supporting certain militias, but they would do so just in order to gain that economic and financial advantage. You see? Now, how great it would be, what testament to our great grandchildren would it leave if world leaders could come together and say, right, here's the DRC, for example, with all of its mineral wealth. It is a scourge on ourselves as a human species that in this country, which is potentially so rich, there are children who starve to death every day. It is a scourge on us as humanity. Let's see how together we can develop this country. Instead, we have Western players in particular who are funding conflict for their own selfish means. So from a South African perspective, we sit in an extremely fortunate position because we are sitting at the same table of a group that is developing economically, infrastructurally, socially, and in every other way possible in leaps and bounds. That same group also has a mindset that is not selfish. I cannot say that they are selfless. I mean, obviously, each country is looking at itself first, but at least there is a sentiment, an ethos of mutual development, mutual progress. At least there is a culture of communication, of non-violent communication, of discussion, of pragmatism. So we are very fortunate to be part of that group. How it is managed going forward is going to be extremely important because you don't want to create another G7 in the future. So in other words, this group of 10 countries must not develop to such an extent that it leaves the rest of the world behind, which of course will then provoke I don't want to say jealousy, but but through inequality you do provoke what Marx would have predicted in terms of his dialectical materialism and people fight, the have-nots fighting against the haves. So it's very, very important that as the G7 grows, it takes the rest of the world along with them. And so far, certainly from where I sit, I can see that this is happening. China especially has it right, where it is doing anything and everything it can to help to develop the rest of the world. So I trust I've answered your question in that respect, Welsh.
Raul, before we finish up this show, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yes, I think it would be remiss of us if we don't speak about Palestine. I just think, you know, as a South African, as most South Africans who have been through a protracted struggle of fighting against discrimination, apartheid, racism, sexism, you know, extreme prejudice, imprisonment without trial, brutality, racial atrocities, ethnic cleansing. We've experienced all of that for a very, very long time. It's very easy for us to identify ourselves with the struggle in Palestine. Very, very easy for us because the people of Palestine are going through the same system of apartheid that we did. I do want to say this, and this is a fact, is that the Israeli government is worse, much, much, much worse, 1,000 times worse than the National Party government ever was. The recent revelation of the mass graves, the bombing of hospitals, universities, schools, all of those things we are seeing live now, right in front of our eyes. And that's because we have the internet, we have social media, and we have good, strong, humanitarian people, brave people who are bringing us those pictures and those videos. But this has been going on since, and not just 1948, from before 1948, when Zionism first took its active course within Palestine. They started with the various militias that they set up, and they ethnically cleansed and displaced people between 750,000 and 900,000. So the history is very clear. It is unfathomable, Welsh. It is shocking, to say the least, for any person in his or her right mind to somehow excuse or defend or try to dilute the atrocity to some notion that says, oh, but you know, Hamas killed people on the 7th of October or whatever. What would you do? Where you live, your grandparents, your parents and yourself, you've never had any freedom whatsoever. You live under the most brutal regime that the world has ever seen over the last 500 years. Ever. What would you do? You have a human spirit within you to take care of your family, to seek freedom. Just the freedom of movement. Never mind anything else. Just the ability to walk out of your house and take a walk around freely without being stopped for any reason, without knowing that when you come back to your home, it's been occupied by someone else, without fearing that when you go to school this morning, maybe a bomb will strike the street and either you will be dead or injured. You know, without thinking that possibly on your way to school today, you may be arrested for no reason, just arrested. Or when you go to sleep at night at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, the police will come there just to instill fear in you and take your mother or your father or you or your brother or your sister. So the struggle for Palestine is a humanitarian struggle. It has nothing to do with religion. The Israeli government is simply using religion as a basis to justify the genocide. So it was, to me, significant and important for South Africa to have taken the lead at the International Court of Justice. There are just some practical things that must happen. Karim Khan of the ICC, the head prosecutor of the ICC, International Criminal Court, he should be fired because he's done absolutely nothing. And I'm not talking about now. Over the past 2 years, Karim Khan has received a plethora of mountains and mountains of evidence from many countries to say that, look, what Israel is doing is wrong, and he's done absolutely nothing about it. Yesterday, they were talking of an investigation. How long must this investigation take? God alone knows, but he should definitely be fired. In fact, the whole world system needs to be transformed. But the people of Palestine are suffering much more than we have ever suffered under apartheid. And that does not in any way take from the atrocities that the apartheid government formed. I'm just providing a comparison. It is indeed encouraging to see that the young people, particularly in the Western world, at universities across America, the UK, Australia, France, and a few other places, are also taking up the struggle. And to them, we say, from me on South Africa's Freedom Day, to yourselves, keep fighting for the freedom of Palestine, keep fighting for an end to the genocide, keep fighting for an end to inequality, keep fighting for an end to starvation, an end to hunger, an end to unemployment, to Africa's development, to South America's development, to Asia's development. And if we could all commit ourselves to getting rid of these man-made inequalities, the world will indeed be a better place. So I'm very, very happy that you have invited me today on this very special day of South Africa, our Freedom Day, our 30-year celebration. I hope that some of my words in our conversation will provide an insight to the mindset of South Africa. I can say with confidence that what I am expressing is fairly representative of the mindset of the large majority of the people of South Africa. Not everyone in South Africa, for sure, will absolutely agree with everything that I have contributed on your show, but majoritarily, I'm pretty confident that it does. As South Africa, we see our part initially as an integral part of Africa's growth and development, and thereafter as an integral part of the growth and development of the global South. And hopefully through our contributions, both as a collective and as individuals like myself and yourself, we can put an end to inequality, hunger, starvation, and all the other evils that currently exist in our world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rahul. It's an honor to have you. Where can people find you?
So I'm on Twitter. I'm not on any other social media. I am trying, without good success, I must say, I'm trying to keep a low profile at the moment. I'm at a stage in my life where I want to keep a low profile for some reasons. If you read between the lines of some of the things in terms of politics and that, I've been a political activist for most of my life. At the moment, I'm still active, but not as a leader, because I wish not to be. And because I've made that decision not to be anymore in leadership within our movement in South Africa, I've decided to keep a low profile. So it's working to a certain extent, but I haven't been all that successful. So you find me on Twitter X, as it's now called. My handle is at Rahul _1990, I think. But I'm not here for monetization. I'm not here for likes and followers. I'm just in my own small way, doing my small part to the development and prosperity and growth of our world and our people. And if that resonates with some, fantastic. If it doesn't with others, understandably so. So yeah, I'm just, again, I say, I'm just happy to chat and converse with whoever it is in a mature and professional and honest manner. And yeah, we move forward as a human species to make the world a better place.
Well, thank you very much, Raul. It was a pleasure having you. Everybody, please go and check Raul out on Twitter. He's a very talented guy. He has a lot of good posts, very knowledgeable about South Africa. Go follow him on Twitter. Go like his stuff. Very knowledgeable. You'll learn so much about South African politics from him. And I just want to say to all South Africans and everyone around the world, happy Freedom Day for South Africa. God bless that nation. And also free Palestine. Palestine will be freed. God bless all the people Palestine who are fighting, and all of the Columbia student, all of the University of Columbia students who are protesting for Palestine's freedom and everywhere around the world. May Palestine be free. And I just want to say to everybody, God bless you all. Remember to like and subscribe to like and share this video. And remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Take care, everybody. God bless you all. Stay safe. Goodbye. God bless you. Bye.